Hi everyone, I'm Margaret Bordeaux. I'm a justice involved overdose prevention specialist. I work in North Carolina's Injury and Violence Prevention Branch. Today I'll be presenting on jail-based overdose prevention strategies and really focusing on one successful strategy. So let's start with a question. Why should we focus on individuals who use drugs and are involved in the justice system? Several studies have reported an increased risk of overdose following release from prison and jail in the United States. A North Carolina-based study of formerly incarcerated people found greater risk of opioid overdose death soon after release. Justice-involved individuals have 40 times greater risk of overdose compared to a typical North Carolina resident. In addition to the other known risk factors of an overdose or an overdose fatality, justice-involved populations have increased risk factors. Finding a safe place to use or to live after incarceration is difficult. Finding a network of people who don't use or people who use who can support you is difficult after incarceration. There's a reduced physiological tolerance even after short periods of incarceration. Environmental factors, such as a new batch of drugs, could be more lethal, very different than what the individual was used to prior to their incarceration. Also, the inability or the access to the trusted sellers or people that you access drugs from prior to incarceration. We should also remember that jails and prisons are not treatment. Periods of inactive use during even short lengths of incarceration is commonly referred to as forced abstinence. Simply being in jail or prison is not an evidence-based treatment. Justice involvement is not a single idea. So in order to provide adequate and appropriate resources and interventions, stakeholders and folks invested in the care of justice-involved individuals must design programming that can meet folks at all points. I've used the sequential intercept model to show where many stakeholders show up. Listed in the model are just some and not all of the stakeholders that are commonly found in those different points of interception. I'd also like to note that in the sequential intercept model, there is an intercept 0, where community-based organizations and other resources and support where folks can reach out prior to justice involvement. We can look at this table and see many opportunities to intervene and help reduce recidivism and also opioid overdose risk. Now we begin to think about strategies to support justice-involved individuals. Strategies listed here can be found at different points of intersect. And this is a pretty well-developed list, but it's not exhaustive. Myself, as someone who looks closely at the needs of this particular service community, I always encourage stakeholders and invested parties to design programs that are practical for their communities, their resource availability, and also the needs of their service population. On this list, we see pre-arrest diversion programs, pre-trial diversion programs, drug treatment programs, naloxone upon release, linkage to care and discharge planning, MAT in jails. We also have referrals to behavioral health and substance use treatment and services, local reentry programs, and referrals to harm reduction services. On this list, I have one strategy highlighted. That is the strategy I'll be focusing on, and that's opioid overdose prevention education programs. So I'll give you guys a little bit of background on how I came into this work. And it was rather fortuitously. Back in 2017, while working at North Carolina Harm Reduction Coalition, I was invited to accompany the instructor of New Hanover County's Opioid Overdose Prevention and Survival course. She was planning to be away for a while, did not want to leave her class unattended, and asked if I would act as her stand-in. I agreed. Recognizing I would be entering into that facility differently than I had in the past. I would go on to become a fixture in the program and would continue that work until my departure from the organization. As I was creating this presentation, I remember some of the first people I shared the news of my new job with. And those were the folks I met with every week at the New Hanover County Jail. They encouraged and supported me in this transition, and I like to dedicate it to them. In 2019, a group of North Carolina-based subject matter experts met, and together they designed the toolkit pictured in this slide. In a project supported by Atlantic Carolina's HIDA, North Carolina Harm Reduction Coalition, North Carolina's Injury and Violence Prevention Branch, and Centers for Disease Control and Prevention Division of Unintentional Injury, the jail-based Overdose Prevention Education Toolkit, a North Carolina Harm Reduction Coalition resource, was created, and the course would be piloted in 3 to 4 new counties across North Carolina. The subject matter experts would meet together as a working group. And early in the inception of the toolkit, it was decided that it would be important for the toolkit to be useful in both the planning and implementation of a jail-based overdose prevention education program. Members of that working group recognized that jail-based programs require support. So guidance on how to plan programs with jail administrators and other detention center and jail staff would also be in the toolkit. That working group was comprised of myself and other recognized overdose education instructors from across the state. The other instructors and myself all thought it would be important to think about how we work with folks who are justice involved, especially in the space of jails and other correctional settings. So the toolkit features the jail-based outreach worker stances and best practices, and it also references SAMHSA's guidelines for working with justice-involved individuals. Another thing very important in the design of this toolkit is a course curriculum with pre- and post-assessment questions is embedded within the toolkit. Emerging programs could use this toolkit to develop and implement overdose education within a jail. Wanted the toolkit to have utility. One of the first sections within the toolkit discusses planning and designing and all the work that goes into thinking about what your opioid overdose education program will look like inside of a jail. These are recommendations from Kay Sanford, a trailblazer in opioid overdose education in North Carolina. As you design an opioid overdose education program, the very first thing you should think about is discuss what is and isn't allowed in the jails prior to the first training. And you want to have conversations and come to agreement with the jail administrator or a program administrator. You want to recognize that change is not always welcome. If a jail did not have an opioid overdose education program prior to you coming, they may not be 100% sure what their expectations are from either side. Allow jail staff to learn about your program and allow yourself to learn how things are run in the jail. I always entered into that space as an invited guest. Very welcome to be there and just happy for the opportunity. It's important to ask detention center staff what would make it easier for you to implement the program at that facility. What would make it easier? What's not another job responsibility for them to do the naloxone distribution piece of the program? If there are any ways that you can support the jail with making the program successful, we think it's important that you talk about it ahead of time and you do what you can to meet those requests. And also, as you're creating this program and you begin to work with the folks who will participate, remember there's no such thing as informed consent. As I mentioned before, a very key piece of the toolkit is the embedded course curriculum and the education component. Within the toolkit, there are sections on introductions, which includes suggestions on how you will meet participants of the program and how they will meet you. There's also an opioid knowledge pre-test assessment. We can't go into this space assuming that we know more about opioids and overdose prevention and survival than the folks that we are sharing that space with. We also must recognize that education around opioid overdose is pretty new, right? So there are many things that we are all still learning. The pre-test assessment is a great way to gather some of that information and really learn more about who's participating in your course. Another section is an overview of overdose prevention. It talks about risk factors. It talks about drug interactions. Also talks about ways folks can reduce their risk of overdose. As we move past that section, we get into how to recognize and respond in the event of an overdose. This section is built out to cover types and administration modes of naloxone, also drug testing. It's another overdose prevention tool. And when we talk about drug testing in North Carolina, within this toolkit, we're talking about fentanyl test strips. And then also discussing Good Samaritan and naloxone access laws, which are really important and which will be dependent on what state or what area your program is in. Also within this curriculum, HIV and hepatitis C risk definition and testing. So really just talking about the risks as it relates to drug use and specifically injection drug use. Some ways participants of the class can learn how to reduce their risk, some more information about HIV and hepatitis, and also really important to share resources about testing. Testing does happen in jails, but I learned that's not a guarantee and it looks different in every jail. So if that is not something that's offered in that jail, you want to have some listings of where folks can access testing when they return to their community. Another really important piece of the education is really talking about harm reduction. What harm reduction services are available in your area, what harm reduction looks like in your state, and talking about syringe service programs and some of the legality there. Just for myself, when I was doing harm reduction programming in New Hanover County, a lot of folks didn't know about the syringe service program prior to the course. So being a part of that overdose prevention course was actually a way to link folks into a service that was available in the community. As we get towards the end of the toolkit, there are some wellness and self-care tools, things that you can share with folks in the class so they can be geared for when they return back to their community. And a post-test assessment, which is optional, but it's just a great way to see how folks are retaining the knowledge that is being shared in this course. And it's also a way to see if there's some areas where you can explain a little bit more, or explain in a way that people can take away from the course what we absolutely think they should understand about overdose prevention. I'm very fond of the post-test. I used to do it in a very creative way. I would get everyone to test and I would say, okay, take off. And they, some folks, they would just be like, it's a test, right? And I'm not a teacher. But never once did I say, you can't ask your neighbor. Never once did I say, you can't use your brochure that we used as a textbook. Folks just assumed that because they heard the word test or quiz. And so once, the test was given, I let everybody and we go over the questions together. So maybe if I got number 1, but I didn't get number 2, but that's something that my neighbor knew, I could use, that opportunity to fill in my tests where there may have been something I was missing. So I just really found that creative and a great way just to make folks feel a little bit better about needing to learn a little bit more. But again, it's optional. One of the most critical parts of this overdose education program is the naloxone upon release component. So in this toolkit it says take-home naloxone programs are evidence-based opioid overdose prevention. A study of drug use risk behavior among heroin users after receiving take-home naloxone found no evidence of compensatory drug use following naloxone overdose training. Basically saying folks were no more inclined to use heroin because they had a take-home naloxone kit. That's just not a thing. The evidence wasn't there to support that. What's important that if folks do use, they have access to naloxone. And this is where the take-home kits are very important and critical to this high-risk population. So, through this course, not only are participants provided with information where they can locally assess naloxone, whether it's their local syringe service program, their local health department, or maybe some local pharmacies. They would get all that information, but they would also be able to receive a kit with their personal items upon release from jail. And that's one of the pieces that you will want to work out with jail administration and jail staff prior to the program. And I suggest, I recommend checking in periodically and see like how that process is going. If it's working out for the jail the way you guys planned it, or if it needs to be modified anyway, and again, how you can support the success of making sure that folks can access that naloxone upon release. So how kits will be distributed will need to be discussed and included in any agreement addendums or any memorandums of understanding that you have with jail administration and other jail staff, again, prior to and during the course of the program. That's really important. You don't want the program to be a burden on the jail. You want it to be a supportive service. Something else the toolkit focuses on, and it's really big for me, is linkage. Again, another recommendation taken from SAMHSA's guide for working with justice-involved individuals was for case management. That would involve like treatment and connection to social services and other social supports, and where folks can really work to address their drug use and also their current involvement with the criminal justice system. So case management has been shown to reduce some of those post-release overdose fatalities and also reduce some rates of recidivism, really getting folks linked and connected to the things that they need, and asking folks what they need, and just working with them to get access to that. The toolkit recommends developing an exit package, and I know one of the other educators who worked on the toolkit, this was something that was embedded in their program, and it was the exit package that had a listing of resources. We think it's important to do this research and to assess resource availability within your community, and also resource accessibility. As we know, sometimes with rules and just other policies in place, every opportunity won't be available to everyone. If there's a way that you can learn more about the resources in your community and who they're looking to serve, and just have that information available for folks prior to being released into the community, and just have that resource developed as a part of the class, and that way you're prepared to answer questions about community resources, and again, do those warm handoffs if needed with that case management, or even just referrals if case management isn't a part of your overdose prevention education program. And most importantly, you want to ensure individuals know where to access harm reduction services if needed once they return back to their communities. Jail-based outreach is simply meeting folks where they are, right? And it always felt really good when folks would come to the syringe service program and they would say, Miss Margaret told me about this place, and they were able to access the harm reduction services they needed. So we want to make sure folks, if they're not aware, they know about this information upon returning to their community, if this is something they didn't know about in the past. So one of my personal favorite sections, and I know I probably said that a dozen times so far, right? Because the toolkit's really good. But this one is near and dear to my heart. Um, and this is really what I want to leave with all of you today, because even if you're not planning to do gel-based programming, this is still really important to think about as we work with folks who may be involved in the justice system some way or have been in the past. And what everything we know about substance use and how drugs are criminalized widely in our country, that's just about everyone who's coming into our program. It's a large number of the folks that we're seeing within harm reduction. So myself and a few others, we thought about, some of the ways that we had learned to work with the folks inside the jail, right? And we brought most of our harm reduction, we brought all of our harm reduction principles there with us, but we recognized that we had to add a few more that would be very specific to that time and place, right? So we came up with some best practices for jail-based outreach, again adapted from Edith Springer's Worker Stances and Best Practice. So I didn't include them all because they can be found in the sample toolkit, which you will all receive a copy of, but I especially want to center these ones listed above. Again, this is if you don't have any takeaways, and I gave you plenty, but if you don't have any up until this point, I know that you'll be able to gain some from this slide. Very valuable to me. When you go into these correctional spaces to provide the jail-based overdose prevention strategies, or at any point of that intercept, that we looked at a little while ago, I think it's important that we take some time, really sit with ourselves, and explore our own values about drugs and drug users, sex and sex workers, but also crimes and the people accused of them, right? We have to be honest, and we have to think about how crime has been portrayed to us over time, and how we may be influenced by what we've seen and what we've been shown. And I encourage everyone to take it a step further by exploring your attitudes about jails and the criminal justice system. I went into the New Hanover County Jail with firsthand trauma, right? It used to be really important to me that I sit with that, right? We should think about these things first and foremost, exploring our own attitudes about these things as we go into our jail-based outreach work. Another thing I learned over time as I was getting to know the participants and they were getting to know me, that two-way street is really important. Be consistent with setting limits, right? And just really being honest with how you present yourself, your knowledge, and your limitations. I met some folks during my jail outreach, and they just had many needs. There were a lot of things. that they were working around in their lives. And just letting them know what I could do for them in a very open and honest way. And everybody being okay with that. I think that's important too. If you go into justice work and you can notice in yourself that you're having a hard time setting these limits, that you're having a hard time recognizing limitations, and not always sure about how you're presenting yourself, it may not be the outreach space for you. That's why we think about this. And this is what we practice as we're doing this jail-based outreach. Because another thing that I found that was really important as I supported the folks who participated in the class, supported justice involved folks in my life, including myself at one point, was it's important not to attempt, I wouldn't even try, to minimize the devastating impact that substance use and criminal activity can have on individuals, their communities, and their families. We don't have to do that. So we won't even try. There's so many more helpful spaces that we can come in, and places and points that we can come in this work to. But we just recognize the importance of having overdose prevention education, and again, meeting folks where they are, being able to come into that space and give them that knowledge, really share that knowledge. Because for me, during my outreach days, it was really that exchange that really influenced and drove my class. I learned so much from those folks, and maybe if you ask them, they'll say they learned a thing or two from me. But it's important not to minimize, the impact. It's also important not to minimize or sensationalize the gravity of mass incarceration. And the consequences that has on individuals, their families, and ultimately their communities. Another personal one for me. But I was able to do this, get to a place where it just was radical acceptance, right? It is what it is. Let's work from where we are. Let's do what we can with what we can while we can. While I have the opportunity to come in this space and to provide this curriculum and to really spend time with the folks who participate in that class. This final point I want to leave you guys with. We believe jail-based outreach workers must have a fundamental understanding of how discriminatory the criminal justice system is to people of color, poor folks, in every step of the process. people of color more likely to engage with the criminal justice system at every point of that sequential intercept model. People of color are overrepresented in jail populations. This may be reflected in who participates in your class, who shows up for your course. So we think it's important to have this fundamental understanding as best practice. Again, these are not all the best practices, but these are the 4 that I wanted to center, and the 4 that I really wanted to close this presentation out on, because again, it's my favorite part of the toolkit. But this is really, for me, the fabric of a successful jail-based overdose prevention program, right? The worker, the jail-based outreach worker, the instructor of the class will really carry a lot of the weight. We work with the jail administrator and the staff to hold that space for the class, allow the jail-based outreach worker to come into the correctional facility, but these best practices are important to how we're engaging with the folks who are participating in the class, how we are protecting ourselves as we go into that space. Any amount of justice involvement, no matter how short, can be traumatic, right? So folks are residing in incarceration, residing in correctional spaces. They're dealing with a lot just in that, outside of all the other things that we know, the other traumas that, we know folks, have gone through. Just being in that space is experience in itself. So we want to make sure we have our stances and our best practices to really hold our programs together. Thank you all for joining me today. This is really good. This is something I love to talk about. I'm glad to have this opportunity. I'm really looking forward to your questions, just to see, if folks are thinking about using the toolkit, if folks are planning jail-based overdose programming, or if they already have one running, and there are things that I didn't talk about that maybe I should have, or if there are also things that, I acknowledge I haven't did this in like a year and a half, right? I'm not so much doing direct service these days, so there may be some new information or some new innovation that you'd like to share with me. I'm definitely open to hearing from each of you. But before I close out this presentation, I want to acknowledge that toolkit work group that I talked about very early on in this presentation. They're all listed there, again, with that support from those 4 agencies and organizations. And a special thanks to Melissa Larson and Sharani Jagroup. This was really their project, but this was the work I was doing prior to the toolkit. So I really took an interest in it, professionally, as I really focus on justice strategies. But this is their baby. this is their toolkit. So I want to thank them for allowing me to present on it, understanding how important this work is for me. I want to thank the Southern Harm Reduction Conference. They will provide a sample toolkit to folks who have joined today. But also, if you'd like to request a formal copy of this toolkit, or if you would like to learn more, I've listed my email address, Melissa's email address, and Sharani's email address. If you have questions about, justice-based programming, I'd be a great person to reach out to. If you have questions about the toolkit, specifically, it'd be great to reach out to Melissa and Sharani, because again, this is their baby. I'd like to thank you all so much for joining me today. Again, very important. I think this work is special. I think this work is really special. I think I'm very fortunate to be able to do this as a career. And I hope you all have been able to learn something from this. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.